Greetings to those of the open right hand. Oh, how thankful I was to turn to chapter 21 of the Screwtape Letters and find out that I didn't have to teach another lesson on sex and chastity this week. Those are about as uncomfortable as they come. This week is about something much simpler, but also more present in most of our lives. Rare is the person who has to beat the other sex off with a stick constantly. But we all must learn how to live lives that cling to nothing but our Lord Jesus Christ. 1 Timothy 6:10 says, "For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs." Money is the root of all kinds of evil, not because green paper is inherently bad, but because of all the things that money could possibly provide and the doorways to evil that it has the power of opening. In just the last couple of years, we have all been horrified by the degrading evils that have been exposed in the lives of many of the powerful, the rich, and the famous in our world. I believe that we have only seen the tip of that iceberg. I remember my mother teaching me, and teaching others, that we had to learn how to live with open hands. It took years before I realized that open hands was just the start of the process. Anyone can pry their hands open through grit teeth and stone heart. We have all been evil to the core of our beings and to the core of our thinking, and still managed to show moments of kindness and begrudgingly spread benevolence in order to appear decent and good to those around us. Even the desire to be seen and judged as good come from spiritual hands gripped so tight they could choke a horse out in 10 seconds flat. The hands must be open to make it through this life intact, but the spirit must be in full cooperation if we plan on leaving this world with our minds intact. Living with open hands and being spiritually awake is the only way to grip firmly to the sanity which God desires for you. God wants you to be stable. He wants you to be content, and He wants you to live a joyful life. And He has provided us the clear path to that blissful state. The problem that most people run into when pursuing the ways of the Lord are that they give up this thing or they give up that thing, but are still secretly in the core of their hearts, even to themselves secretly sometimes, gripping firmly onto the last 2 or 3 secret possessions on which their egos tell them they depend. The ego will do anything it must to survive, and lying is at the top of the self-preservation playlist. The ego goes so far as to convince the soul that it wouldn't even know itself anymore if it gave up this or that possession, or this or that anger, or this or that opinion. To abandon the possession of the self is the most frightening thing a human can go through, and it is also the only way to find true self and fully experience what I believe Jung would call full integration. The worst cases of insanity that I have run into in this world will never be put into a padded room. They will never walk the halls of Bedlam. They will never be restrained by a straitjacket. In fact, the worst cases of insanity I've ever seen come in the forms of Rihanna, Nicki Minaj, Cardi B, R. Kelly, and Kevin Spacey. These people will consistently be rewarded for their insanity unless, of course, they cross the line of the last taboo, pedophilia. And don't doubt me when I say that just like the other taboos that have fallen in our lifetimes, if the world remains unchecked, that taboo will be normalized as well, and God help us. In fact, it is already starting to happen. I think Lewis was a spiritual genius to group earthly possessions so close to his chapters on chastity. The two forms of failure play off of each other and in many ways drive each other. If you wonder how that can be, then spend a little time meditating on the old marketing truth, sex sells. If you have never researched subliminal advertising, then do so and be amazed. What a joyful world we would have if all the sleepers would wake up and see through the ancient Egyptian craft. If you have ever watched a man or a woman tip from fascination to ownership of a romantic interest, and we all have, then you have seen how closely desire and possession intermingle. It can be very ugly. And Lewis is genius twice over to focus on the ownership of time as the example which he will use in this chapter. No matter how rich or how poor we are in this world, we all think we own at least one thing, and that one thing is our time. Of all the things in this world to give up, time is one of the hardest, if not the hardest, to relinquish. James 4:13 through 15 says to us, "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit, yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that." That whole statement indicates who is in ownership. Psalm 39:5-6 says, "Behold, you have made my days a few handbreadths, and my lifetime is as nothing before you. Surely all mankind stands as a mere breath. Selah. Surely a man goes about as a shadow. Surely for nothing they are in turmoil." I'm going to repeat that. Surely for nothing they are in turmoil. Man heaps up wealth and does not know who will gather. And Proverbs 27:1 says, "Do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring." Many wise teachers across many cultures have had this truth revealed to them. Being under the delusion that you own anything is the source of many mental tortures, as well as being responsible for many wars and many broken families. We have all heard stories about a once happy family broken to pieces and demolished beyond recognition simply because someone read a will. I know this from my own life. If I own my time instead of giving it to the Lord, I will hate people. That's just the way it works. If I own my money, then I will not help anyone, and I will think poorly of those with less and envy those with more. If I own my wife, she will feel domineered and trapped. If I own my children, they will feel exacerbated and forced to rebel. If I own anything, there will be a price of relationship that must be paid. But if I live the path of the open hand, and if my soul is on board with that plan, then I will start watching in ever-growing and miraculous ways that when God says, you pay attention to my kingdom and I'll handle everything else in your life, that I had not been owning my life, I had been owning death. And through the kingdom of my Lord, life, and that more abundantly, has finally filled my mind, my body, and my soul. Every time you find your hand gripped around something, remind yourself that you are clinging to death. No matter how valuable you think it is, no matter how desirable you think it is, no matter how much you think you have a right to that thing, opinions included, unclench your fist, let it go, get your soul in line with that truth, and be amazed as God fills your empty hands with faith and hope and love beyond measure. Life can be good if you will let it go. That's not Johnny talking. That's Jesus talking. In his own words, he puts it like this: "For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will save it." Try for just a moment to imagine a life in which you cannot be stolen from, you cannot be robbed, you cannot be insulted, you cannot be maligned, and you cannot be accused of selfishness. Hey, John Lennon, I got some better lyrics for you, brah. Let's flip to chapter 21 of the Screwtape Letters and hear what our vile enemies plan to do to keep us locked into their world system of desire and possessions. And remember, their father is our enemy, and their enemy is our father. Chapter 21. My dear Wormwood, yes, a period of sexual temptation is an excellent time for working in a subordinate attack on the patient's peevishness. It may even be the main attack, as long as he thinks it the subordinate one. But here, as in everything else, the way must be prepared for your moral assault by darkening his intellect. Men are not angered by mere misfortune, but by misfortune conceived as injury, and the sense of injury depends on the feeling that a legitimate claim has been denied. The more claims on life, therefore, that your patient can be induced to make, the more often he will feel injured and, as a result, ill-tempered. Now, you will have noticed that nothing throws him into a passion so easily as to find a tract of time which he reckoned on having at his own disposal unexpectedly taken from him. It is the unexpected visitor when he looked forward to a quiet evening, or the friend's talkative wife turning up when he looked forward to a tete-a-tete with the friend that throw him out of gear. Now, he is not yet so uncharitable or slothful that these small demands on his courtesy are in themselves too much for it. They anger him because he regards his time as his own and feels that it is being stolen. You must therefore zealously guard in his mind the curious assumption, my time is my own. Let him have the feeling that he starts each day as the lawful possessor of 24 hours. Let him feel as grievous tax that portion of his property which he has to make over to his employers, and as a generous donation that further portion which he allows the religious duties. But what he must never be permitted to doubt is that the total from which these deductions have been made was, in some mysterious sense, his own personal birthright. You have here a delicate task. The assumption which you want him to go on making is so absurd that if once it is questioned, even we cannot find a shred of argument in its defense. The man can neither make nor retain one moment of time. It all comes to him by pure gift. He might as well regard the sun and moon his chattels. He is also in theory committed to a total service of the enemy. And if the enemy appeared to him in bodily form and demanded that total service for even one day, he would not refuse. He would be greatly relieved if that one day involved nothing harder than listening to the conversation of a foolish woman. And he would be relieved almost to the pitch of disappointment if for 1/2 hour in that day the enemy said, now you may go and amuse yourself. Now, if he thinks about his assumption for a moment, even if he is bound to realize that he is actually in this situation every day, when I speak of preserving this assumption in his mind, therefore, the last thing I mean you to do is to furnish him with arguments in its defense. There aren't any. Your task is purely negative. Don't let his thoughts come anywhere near it. Wrap a darkness about it, and in the center of that darkness let his sense of ownership in time lie silent, unexpected, and operative. The sense of ownership in general is always to be encouraged. The humans are always putting up claims to ownership which sound equally funny in heaven and in hell, and we must keep them doing so. Much of the modern resistance to chastity comes from men's beliefs that they own their bodies. Those vast and perilous estates pulsating with the energy that made the worlds in which they find themselves without their consent, and from which they are ejected at the pleasure of another. It is as if a royal child whom his father has placed for love's sake in titular command of some great province under the real rule of wise counselors should come to fancy he really owns the cities, the forest, and the corn, in the same way he owns the bricks on the nursery floor. We produce this sense of ownership not only by pride, but by confusion. We teach them not to notice the different senses of the possessive pronoun, the finely graded differences that run from my boots through my dog, my servant, my wife, my father, my master, and my country to my God. They can be taught to reduce all these senses to that of my boots, the my of ownership. Even in the nursery, a child can be taught to mean by my teddy bear, not the old imagined recipient of affection to whom it stands in a special relation, for that is what the enemy will teach them to mean if we are not careful. But the bear I can pull to pieces if I like. And at the other end of the scale, we have taught men to say, my God, in a sense not really very different from my boots, meaning the God on whom I have a claim from my distinguished services and whom I exploit from the pulpit, the God I have done in a corner. And all the time, the joke is that the word mine, in its fully possessive sense, cannot be uttered by a human being about anything. In the long run, either our Father or the enemy will say mine of each thing that exists, and especially of each man. They will find out in the end, never fear, to whom their time, their souls, and their bodies really belong. Certainly not to them, whatever happens. At present, the enemy says mine of everything, on the pedantic, legalistic ground that he made it. Our Father hopes in the end to say mine of all things, on the more realistic and dynamic ground of conquest. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. Look at the world around us. Marriage redefined to a point of not amounting to much more than a tax deduction document. The most morally bankrupt amongst us having their pockets lined by even those within the church. Our politicians believing we are so ignorant that an interview with an artist famous for singing about her genitalia is a way of currying public favor. And sadly, he seemed to be right. The list goes on and on. Many times throughout the year, I have sat and watched small children learn how to share with each other. They start off grabbing some other child's toy and not giving it back, which leads to tears and tantrums. Parents sit down and try to teach the kids about sharing and giving. We try to convince them that it's not that big a deal. They will have to grow up and learn how to deal with such things and worse. But have we learned what we teach? Do we practice what we preach? If you find yourself miserable today, and you have been miserable for quite some time, perhaps you have come to church looking for solace. Perhaps you have read all the self-help books on the market. Perhaps you have gone to couples counseling and seen a psychologist. I've even heard of people going to psychologists that have told them that they are depressed because they haven't owned enough of their time and stuff, and that they need to look out for themselves for a little while. I am not a psychologist, nor have I written any self-help books. But I have it on good authority from the scriptures and teachings of my Lord, that if you will instead just open up your hands and your heart, you might find the joy you have been missing. You might find your life, your whole life, the very moment you intentionally lose it. You might find that you have been deceived, and that the death is the only thing you are clinging to. And the moment you let it go, and allow Jesus to take all your death to the cross with him, then and only then do you find life everlasting and full and abundant. Go give something away.